Hello YouTube, it's me, your humble host Logan Albright, back with another book review for you. And today I want to talk about Alice Isn't Dead by Joseph Fink. Joseph Fink is the creator of the Welcome to Nightvale podcast as well as the Alice Isn't Dead podcast, and this is the second book I've read by him. The first one was called It Devours, and it was a Welcome to Nightvale novel, and it was sort of a comedic take on a horror novel, sort of cosmic horror with a comedic spin on it. And I found that an enjoyable, if not an amazing read, and I was expecting something kind of similar here, but what I got was quite different, so I want to talk about that. Alice Isn't Dead is about a woman named Keisha who is looking for her lost wife, Alice, who has vanished and is presumably dead, but she, keeps the faith and knows that she isn't really dead, and she travels across sort of this hellscape in order to find her lost wife. And so that's the basic plot. And then along the way, she stumbled upon sort of this crazy conspiracy, and there's these horrific things that go on along the way. The most noticeable of which is the existence of these people who she calls thistlemen. They work for the Thistle Corporation, and they're these sort of bloated, overweight, obese, disgusting men who are basically zombies and who kill people and eat them and eat their faces off. And the most noticeable difference between this book and the previous book is that there's not a trace of humor in this. This is very serious. I was really expecting a similar kind of jokey vibe to it, but this is a completely straightforward book with no jokes in it. So the problem with that I found is that it takes away part of the excuse for the rest of the story being a bit thin. And It Devours, the horror plot wasn't the most amazing plot ever written, but there were jokes, so it was okay. This is a similar kind of story. Well, the story's not similar in content, but it's a similarly thin premise. And then there's no humor to lighten it up or make it more interesting or make it more forgivable that it's a thin premise. So that's the first thing about it. And then the second thing about it that I really wanted to talk about, which is sort of the meat of this video, is the lack of detail. This is something that I think is maybe a difficult line for writers to walk, which is how much detail, how much explanation do you give? Do you want to be explain everything, be super detailed, really lay it in there, or do you want to leave it more mysterious and open to the reader? And it can be done both ways, but it has to be done artfully. For example, my favorite book is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, and one of the things that I really, really love about that book is how much detail there is, but how much is left unexplained. There's a lot of references to his earlier writings from the Silmarillion and things that hadn't been published at the time. So for a first-time reader, you dive into it and you're like, I don't know who Gil-galad was, and I don't know who Elendil is, and I don't know what Numenor is, and all these things. And it makes the world feel really rich and deep, and you feel like it's immersive, and it feels like a real thing as opposed to something that was written. So leaving out detail in that sense can be really good. Another way leaving out detail can be good is in a short story format, I think. I feel like the author is sort of channeling H.P. Lovecraft in parts, and Lovecraft likes to leave a lot of things to your imagination, particularly as a horror writer, because we all know the scariest thing is the unknown. And so if you don't quite know what's going on, you don't quite know what's behind all this stuff, it's a little more terrifying. But I think that works better in a short story format than in a novel. In a novel, you have the space to kind of learn more about your characters and about your world and about your story, and it's kind of a shame if you don't take advantage of it. And I feel like that's a real weakness of Alice Isn't Dead, is that all these things just sort of happen, and we're not really told why. We're not really explained what the backdrop is. We're not really explained how the world got to be this way. I think he's kind of going for this ambiguous cosmic horror dread feeling by not telling us what's going on. But to me, it just felt a little bit lazy and a little bit thin. For example, in the first scene of the book, Keisha's eating in a restaurant, and one of the thistlemen is in the booth next to her, and he eats the restaurant owner's face. And nobody really seems shocked by that, or no one really bats an eye at it too much. It just sort of happens, and it's well, what's going on? What is this world? Why aren't the police showing up to do anything about this? Why is nobody caring? And it never really fully gets explained. There's parts of it that get explained, but it never fully gets explained. And to me, that was unsatisfying. And I feel like you could get away with that in a short story, but you can't get away with it in a novel, because I want to know more. You have the space. Go ahead and tell me more in a novel. This really reads to me like a piece of kind of internet creepypasta that's been expanded out to novel length. And I like those things. Internet creepypasta gets pretty cool because you just get a paragraph. You just get a little fragment. And you're like, well, what's that about? That's kind of cool and mysterious and creepy, and I don't know what's going on there. And it lets your imagination run wild with it. But when you have a whole book, it's just lazy not to do more than that. So I was kind of disappointed in that. So I think that this is an interesting topic to talk about, is how much detail do you put in your book. You don't want to over-explain. You don't want to like turn your work of art, your novel, into this textbook that just lays out every detail in perfect order. But you also don't want it to be unsatisfying and feeling like you don't actually have the answers to these questions. In the case I brought up earlier, Tolkien's case, he knew the answers to all those questions, and you can tell that he knew the answers to all those questions. So when I'm reading The Lord of the Rings and I'm like, what's Numenor? I don't know what that is. When I come across a reference to it, like, I know that there is an answer. I don't think he just made up a random name and doesn't have any more thought behind it. And I think that comes through. That's something you can tell as a reader, whether the author knows that or not. And I really felt like there wasn't that behind this. The author just wanted it to be spooky and didn't want to do a lot of world building, and so left it ambiguous. And to me, it was unsatisfying. My other issue with this book, and a lot of modern books that I read, which is why I mainly review older books on this channel, is I just feel like there's a little preachiness to it. There's a little bit of a political agenda at play, and I feel like I'm being lectured at some of the time, and I don't like to be lectured at. Like, spoiler alert if you want to read it. I'll give you a pause there to turn off the video if you want to. But in the end, it turns out that the Thistlemen, it turns out racism was really the enemy all along. The Thistlemen were just racists, and they became evil monsters. So it's all like the monster thing is an allegory for racism. And like, to me, that's just dumb. Like, it's so annoying when authors do that. Like, if you want to write a book about racism, just write a book about racism. If you want to write a book about monsters, just write a book about monsters. This idea that you're going to just use monsters as an allegory for your political views in sort of the laziest way possible, honestly. Just at the end of the book, you just say, oh yeah, those monsters were just racist. That's who that they were. And they just turned into monsters because racism is bad. Like, I don't know. I don't get anything out of that. It just feels like a way to virtue signal and a way to preach to people. And it doesn't really serve the story. Like, we know racism is bad. You don't need to be told. That's not interesting, or it's not a hot take, you know? It's not a hot take for the conclusion of your book to be, oh, don't be a racist. Yeah, we know. We know not to be a racist. It's not something we need to be told. So I don't like that. It's like Stephen King does this sometimes, and it sort of annoys me. The real monster was alcoholism. The real monster was child abuse. Like, just write a book about alcoholism or child abuse if you want to do that. Like, if you want to write a monster, I don't go to my horror for social commentary. I go to my horror for scary stories. And I think it's more interesting if you actually build a terrifying universe with the monsters you created and talk about those. Or if you want to do more realistic horror, that's also more interesting. And you want to do it without supernatural elements and make child abuse the monster, you can do that, and that's interesting. But just saying, oh, here's a ghost story, and then it turns out at the end the ghost was a real-life social problem, I think that's kind of tired and played out. I don't think it's that interesting. So overall, I didn't really enjoy Alice Isn't Dead. It didn't make me laugh, which I guess it wasn't supposed to, but from the previous book I thought it was going to. It felt underwritten. I felt like it wasn't as developed as much as it could have been. The characters were all kind of flat as well. That's another thing I wanted to say. I felt like the characters were sort of interchangeable. I didn't really get a sense of their personalities. I didn't really find them likable. They just were there to service the plot, and like, I don't know, I didn't get much out of the characters. So I felt it was underwritten in that regard. And then the third aspect is I found it a little bit preachy, and I don't like books to preach at me. I like my entertainment to be entertainment, and if I want to be preached at, I'll go to church. So those are my thoughts on Joseph Fink. I'm sorry to be critical, but I just try to be honest on this channel, tell you guys what I think. I'm coming up on finishing Stephen King's The Stand, speaking of Stephen King from earlier, which I'm really enjoying. So I'll do a review of that as soon as I finish it, but it's a crazy long book, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, I've been Logan Albright. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you later.